let's go on to our first speaker, Dr. Janet O'Shea. So welcome, Janet.
Thank you, Jane. Happy Earth Day, everyone. It's an honor to be presenting as part of this distinguished panel. You'll be hearing shortly about the science of animal agriculture's impact on the environment and about the politics of meat production. So I won't dwell on those issues for long. And instead, I'm going to talk about something that pertains to my area of interest and specialization, which is the structure of activism. And I'm particularly interested today in offering some thoughts about this as it relates to efforts to counter climate breakdown, especially in the arena of food. In particular, I'd like to share some thoughts about some false dichotomies in environmental thinking and activism. So by this point, most environmental organizations recognize the impact that animal agriculture has on climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean dead zones, desertification, water usage and supply, and so on. However, as soon as this is acknowledged, it's often followed up with something like, well, we recognize that animal agriculture and meat production has a huge impact on the environment, but remember, individual action is not enough to stave off environmental disaster. This assertion contains within it several false assumptions. One, the assumption that it's impossible to get large numbers of people to change their behavior at once. Two, that behavior change happens in isolation. Three, that behavior change and systemic change are at odds. And four, that veganism, vegetarianism, flexitarianism are only about and can only ever be about individual dietary choices. So here's why these assumptions are wrong. That behavior change can't happen in large numbers. Well, as my co-panelist, Dr. Sailesh Rao, has pointed out, anybody who thinks that you can't get large numbers of people to make behavior change at once is not thinking enough about what Mohandas Gandhi achieved in the Indian nationalist movement, specifically through the Khadi movement. So the Khadi movement was an effort on behalf of Indian independence activists to get the populace to reject the purchasing of British cloth and to instead spin and wear their own cotton. So this was crucial to the Indian independence movement. In fact, it's the shift from British cloth to khadi is often credited with destabilizing the entire British Empire. So clearly, behavior change can make a difference. But even more generally, people taking individual action and making behavior change at once in community and in sync with each other, that's precisely what a boycott is. And we know that boycotts have had a huge influence over the course of activist history. As to the idea that behavior change has to happen in isolation, in reality, behavior change never happens in a vacuum. We influence others and they influence us. And we can see the negative effect of this. Jane just showed a slide saying that vegans represent 3% of the US population, vegetarians represent 4%. Part of the reason why these numbers appear so low is that a lot of people try reducing their meat consumption or eliminating it, and then they go back to their old way of eating. And the research suggests they do this because of a lack of social support. So we know that this can work in a negative effect, that the behavior of others can influence us. But we can also see that this can happen in a positive sense. And in addition, that influence doesn't just have to be person to person, but we can actually influence the institutions that we're part of. And I'll revisit that shortly. The idea that behavior change and systemic change are at odds is also a peculiar one. There's this idea that behavior change is somehow a distraction, that it can be an excessive or almost obsessive focus on minute actions. But recent research suggests that even though this has been sort of the received wisdom of environmental activism for a few decades now, that behavior change is a distraction. In fact, it's not the case. That individual action sets the stage for policy change. It normalizes taking action against environmental degradation, and it encourages other people to take the climate crisis seriously. So if we consider an example from the advocacy against fossil fuel usage, we'll kind of see perhaps that the idea that individual action is a distraction, we can see how spurious it is. No one ever suggests that riding a bicycle distracts from advocacy for safer streets or for cities that are less fossil fuel dependent. In fact, we tend to assume, like, oh, of course, the people advocating for bike lanes are going to be the cyclists. And those bike lanes might make our cities less carbon dependent and safer and more efficient. But we also assume that it does take the effort of people getting on those bicycles and riding them. Whereas when it comes to food, somehow we question that assumption, and I think that's problematic. The idea that veganism, vegetarianism, flexitarianism are only individual dietary choices is likewise problematic. There's a reason why we have that assumption. Part of it is about the history of vegetarianism. It's been associated with various religious traditions, with spiritual practices, efforts at improving mental clarity and fitness. In addition, within a capitalist system, what we purchase is how we express our agency. So there's this idea, I think, particularly in the United States, and elsewhere in the global north, that our food choices, my food choices are my right. They're just about me individually. But if we look at the development of modern veganism, and actually if we look at its historical antecedents, back in the global north, going back at least a few centuries, in Asia, going back through the Ahimsa traditions, we see this idea that actually the efforts to abstain from meat are also part of a social movement. And if anything, these efforts remind us that our food choices are political. So we might want to just take a moment to consider why these assumptions are at play in the first place. Why do we have this idea that reducing our meat consumption is really just almost a form of virtue signaling? Well, one thing has to do with the difference between the fossil fuel and the animal agriculture industries. The fossil fuel industry has spent years encouraging personal responsibility for the climate crisis. We've probably all heard this idea by now that the carbon footprint was invented by fossil fuel companies. Incidentally, the fossil fuel companies, when they were encouraging us to think about our carbon footprint, were still encouraging pretty incremental changes. You know, they weren't saying, for example, get rid of your car, stop flying completely, live in a smaller home. But instead, they were saying things like, oh, purchase energy efficient light bulbs. In addition, at the very same time that the fossil fuel industry was encouraging personal responsibility and encouraging individual actions, the meat industry was doing exactly the opposite, and they were discouraging individual action. So there was a somewhat recent publication by Jennifer Joquette and Loredana Loy showing exactly this, looking at meat industry documentation and showing that there was a concerted effort to debunk any kind of effort towards the reduction of meat was going to have an impact on the environment. In addition, a recent Guardian article reflected on the response to the release of the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet Guidelines. Those were produced in 2019, and they were recommending a reducitarian diet framework, focused significantly on meat reduction, particularly red meat, and on a significant increase in the consumption of legumes, whole grains, nuts, seeds, fruits, and vegetables. And there was a huge backlash against the release of these diet guidelines. The Guardian recently uncovered that that backlash was almost entirely engineered by an animal agriculture funded PR company, by one PR company. So when polluting industries discourage something, we can probably surmise that that something is effective. In addition, another reason why this assumption is at play, like, oh, our choices aren't going to make a difference, is because of climate doomism. And we've seen more of this in recent years. It's too late. There's nothing we can do. And again, that idea, it's a compelling one. It's a serious problem that we're facing. But the widespread circulation of that idea has been assisted by the polluting industries, because if we give up, then there's less of a challenge to their profit margins. So the key point here is that the fossil fuel industries and the animal agriculture industries are structured quite differently. There's a limit to how much consumer efforts can influence fossil fuel usage because even if I turn down the AC or the thermostat at home, or even if I ride a bike or drive an electric car, so much of our fossil fuel usage happens in contexts where we don't control um, that fossil fuel usage. So things like schools, workplaces, public facilities. Whereas when we make a change to our dietary patterns, that change carries with us, regardless of what context we're in. The subsidy system, of course, does mute market signals, but it doesn't override them completely. And we can bump up the effect of our individual dietary practices with campaigns like greener by default, default veg, plant-based by default, and so on. So this gets to the next question, which is what can we do to challenge these assumptions? Because as important as it is to make individual changes and to encourage others to make those individual changes, we do in fact need systemic change. And part of that is recognizing that these behavior changes are transferable and transmissible. And that entails rejecting that idea that they don't make a difference. So what can we do about it? Well, one thing is that we can identify our behavior change as a boycott. So instead of saying, for example, oh, well, I don't eat meat because I care about animals or workers or the environments, to phrase it differently and to say, well, I reject animal products because it is an economic boycott of an unjust system. We can also participate in efforts towards systemic change, things like changing the subsidy system. That can be part of our advocacy, and our individual choices can be part of living the truth that informs that advocacy. We can advocate towards changing the dietary guidelines, pursuing options like what they've done in Denmark with chef training, menu and choice architecture, and enhancing both supply and demand. We can also articulate the relationship of behavior change to larger struggles to create a more just food system. So we can think about veganism, vegetarianism, flexitarianism as being about connecting the dots between animal exploitation, the exploitation of human workers, the rise of zoonotic disease, degenerative disease, food oppression, food insecurity, climate breakdown, and other forms of environmental crisis. We can focus on how our behavior change dovetails with an organized coalitional movement to bring about a kinder, more just food system. And at the crux of it, there is little that would be more of a systemic change than that. Thank you.